Through this threshold you might enter one of the many ancient gates to what was called Amazon.com. Through this tunnel of dark glass you might leave the world behind and pass beneath and between what might have been the pavilion of private innovation, or maybe the temple of glorious bringing together, or perhaps the hall of harmonious enhancement. All these pavilions were eternally devoted to transforming every human interaction to a transaction, a term which meant always get more than you give. A transaction was the prime method for ongoing transfer of invisible currency from those outside to those inside. Enter this land of transaction now and begin your journey to the crystal spheres. Like many regimes in the cenotaphic era, approaching the end of the age of malehood, the crystal spheres maintained dominion by keeping humans separate and utterly dependent not on each other, but on the institutions of transaction. So humans were chronically sad and lonely and blaming each other for their constant crises. The only remedies they could perceive were more separation and more transactions, so they loved the regime for offering transactions they called convenient, by which they meant free of interactions with other humans, and what they called cheap, by which they meant of poor quality and manufactured by very distant, unthought-of humans who were given hardly any currency at all. Transactions thus became their pleasure, their progress, their entertainment, their survival, and by controlling all these transactions and taking for each a tiny bit of invisible currency, the crystal spheres became over time a kind of monarchy, divinely appointed by virtue of their wealth and aspiring to be what they called in their time the one true operating system for all. As you walked from one pavilion to another, you might encounter the many plazas and thoroughfares which gave the appearance of belonging to all, which they did not. These many arcades and courtyards were the work of the Ministry of Public Munificence, which maintained the crucial and widely spread illusion that the crystal spheres were creating wealth for everyone, not just for those inside. But the more it became visible that the spheres were creating not wealth, but extreme lack of wealth, the more important this illusion became and required elaborate distractions, such as atriums of generous artification, with high-status works of visual beauty, and the Ministry of Conspicuous Minor Giving, which organized small but highly visible gifts to projects that gave some help to the ever-increasing number of humans joining the ranks of those outside. Walking toward the equator now, we think you would pass one of the many temples of invisible currency, which contained the invisible means of exchange which humans used to ask permission from each other for everything anyone did every day. The currency itself was commonly believed to multiply by itself like a virus when left alone inside one of the many temples of many sizes built to store it, as if it had weight or volume. They seem to imagine that if one of these temples were to disappear, the invisible currency which they believed to live inside would disappear with it. No religion at any other time had so many believers or such total unchallenged control. The volume of invisible currency amassed by the crystal spheres was considered proof of divine entitlement for their regime. No one has yet determined the specific locations of each of the legendary temples, but evidence suggests that on this spot stood the Gate of Benevolent Welcome, which was the original entrance before the regime spread to dominate in all directions. The Gate of Benevolent Welcome was either a physical gate or one of several, or maybe no physical barrier at all, but only a massive visual reminder that some had the status of those inside and could go anywhere and do anything with their special identification tags, while others had the status of those outside and could walk here but also could be expelled for lack of invisible currency. currency. With or without the physical walls, more and more places became exclusive for those inside and effectively forbidden to those outside. So that name, Amazon, which was chosen to mean both exotic and easy to use, came to mean Forbidden City, at least for many. One of the least understood customs of the ancient cenotaphic era was the common human practice of saying, "I own it," and meaning that human had total power over it to make use or ignore or destroy it at will. This declaration of absolute power was something humans granted to themselves and applied to everything in their world, even sometimes to other humans who became the it of this ownerness. You can try this yourself. Turn to a moving or unmoving creature and say, "I own you. You are my object. I may use or ignore or destroy you at will." We know this feels odd, but they did it all the time. Try it on a creature just like yourself. Have someone say this to you. This addictive and highly contagious disorder was widespread and lasted for thousands of years and determined the status of everyone living in the regime of the crystal spheres. The Grand Temple of Terrestrial Possession constantly identified new objects or materials which could be declared by those inside to be totally in their control or owned, so those outside would be forced to give their invisible currency, when they had any, to use those objects or materials. The term possession also seemed to mean expansion and was expansively applied to ground, water, air, certain stones, anything else they could call a resource, by which they seemed to imagine something which had no opinion about itself. This process of expanding and possessing resources would not have been possible without the force supplied by the Palace of Tranquil Compliance, which you will encounter later on your tour. Nearby, the Temple of Celestial Expansion, also translated Celestial Possession, came into being because they thought the only way that they could spend their massive amount of invisible currency, which they in their time referred to as winnings, was on space travel to other worlds. This project, which they called Blue Origin, seemed to imagine an entire universe which had no opinion about itself and only existed as a kind of resource for humans to possess and fulfill their destiny of ever-expanding transactions while leaving far behind their home planet with its troubles and all those many outside. The humans who lived in the cenotaphic era greatly desired what they called fulfillment, by which they meant their power to own. The Ministry of Distant Fulfillment managed the many and massive fulfillment citadels they set far away from the crystal spheres. Inside these distant fulfillment citadels, humans who were not fulfilled at all were made to work all day and all night without rest, without food, without bodily functions. At first, these workers were fabricators, producing products for others to own, but over time those fabricators were moved even farther from centers of power, and the citadels of fulfillment were filled with workers merely moving those products from faraway places to closer places, all to make sure that products came quickly to those who would own them and be fulfilled again and again and again. The desired effect was that products appeared to be made and delivered by no humans at all. In the process of granting all power to themselves, humans declared that even the ground between these monuments was what they called owned. To demonstrate their total control, what they called their ownerness, the Ministry of Owning Dirt covered the ground between monuments with a petroleum waste product called asphalt, or else with hardened limestone and sand. These formed a kind of horizontal wall that even water could not pass through, and was felt to declare the power of humans over the earth under their feet. If you're walking, speak to the ground under your feet that was one time walled over with limestone and sand and petroleum waste. Do not use your mouth. Speak in the present or back in time. As you choose. Life in the Cenotaphic Age was perceived as a kind of endless struggle at which the great majority would fail and only a few would succeed or win, which meant at once to prove superior and also to possess or own. Those inside were widely considered to have reached winning, even though their lives inside were still unending struggles for rank and status. Wealth, in the form of invisible currency, was considered the measure of winning, and thus of personal value, regardless of how that wealth was gained, and the highest concentration of wealth was considered the highest form of winning. The fact of owning all that wealth meant you were also one of the deserving, and those deserving the necessary wealth were estimated to be no more than 10 or 5 or 1%. This ever-increasing concentration of wealth in the hands of fewer and fewer resulted in extreme lack of wealth for those outside, who were thus perceived as not winning and therefore lacking in personal value and therefore invisible or worse. Slightly off our walking route was the Palace of Tranquil Compliance, which housed the heavily weaponed protectors needed to maintain the regime of the Crystal Spheres. These heavily weaponed protectors were needed because in the late Cenotaphic era, all of the ground and everything else was what they called owned, which meant it was under the total control of some human demanding invisible currency for its use. This ongoing fancy of ownerness was only sustained by considerable force which the Palace of Tranquil Compliance supplied, along with another nearby bureau which they in their time called government. Apparently personal safety could also be owned, and so across the street from the Palace of Tranquil Compliance was the Palace of Privatized Tranquil Compliance for those with sufficient invisible currency. The ultimate spiritual fulfillment of transaction was found in the portal of transactionless transaction, directly in the shadow of the Crystal Spheres, where humans were able to transact without awareness they were even transacting. Transaction without relationship, at last. But even to approach and enter the portal, you had to be known. They had to own all knowledge of you, inside and out, your every thought, your every move, so they could record and examine and approve what you did, what you do, what you will do next, and send that data to be compiled at the Palace Garden of the Future of the Mind. The portal was a favorite of those in the middle, a group neither quite inside nor outside. Those in the middle apparently were taught that ever more transactions would someday raise them to the ranks of those inside, though in practice this rarely came to be. Dominating the Forbidden City were the 2 high towers of One Day Forever and the 3 Crystal Spheres, home of divine monarchs. The Crystal Spheres were magical instruments meant to gather all the invisible currency and wealth of their world into one location. The spheres were a shrine to transaction, the term meaning get more than you give, and contained a wealth of actual plants which were brought from faraway places on the planet to decorate and give the impression that all the natural world was at hand for the delectation and enjoyment of those who lived and worked inside. They built 3 spheres instead of 2, apparently hoping to stop other humans from making jokes about testicles. They failed. In the heart of the Crystal Spheres was found the Palace Garden of the Future of the Mind, where your thoughts were made to last forever by being inferred from your many transactions until the Palace Garden could gather enough information about your thoughts that they could predict what you would think next and make a transaction the instant you think it. Their success was so great that it came to pass you did not need to think your next thought, because it was already being thought for you. At last you could truly free your mind from the burden of thinking whatsoever and focus on being fulfilled in your owning the objects of your many unnoticed transactions. It's not clear whether the fall of the spheres and all the pavilions and great monuments was sudden or gradual, or by great force, or by neglect and abandon and decay. All we know is the crystal spheres and Forbidden City and the many gates and the multitude of transactions that made those gates and walls and monuments possible disappeared and left behind surprisingly little, considering how fully they dominated the lives of so many for so long. We also know there were those who did not accept the power of the regime, and those of us who came after looked back and look back still with thanks to those who struggled to resist the crystal spheres. Say something back in time if you care to, not with your mouth, to those who struggled against a regime that seemed in its time to be invincible, though it was not.